welcome to our 7th Threat Intel session on the pathway to a successful threat intelligence function with Dr. Jamie Collier from FireEye. Just before we kick off today's session, I think it's important that we acknowledge what's happened in the last week and a half with the HSE ransomware attack. We've all seen the increase internationally in cyber attacks, from SolarWinds to the Colonial Pipeline attack. But this has really become a reality for the Irish government and people over the past week, and really brings home the message that no country or organisation is immune from these cyber criminals. The attack on the HSE is the most significant cyber attack in the history of the Irish state, if not the most serious criminal incident in Ireland in recent history. And the fact that these criminals have targeted our healthcare sector during a pandemic is nothing short of despicable. They should be treated as pariahs and hunted down like international organised crime gangs. But I suppose what has been heartening over the past week and a half is the collaborative response from government and industry, including so many of our member companies who have stepped forward in this crisis to provide their considerable expertise to the HSE, to hospitals and to government. So I suppose now more than ever, the important role for public-private partnerships is really evident, and the role of industry in securing our national security and protecting our economy and society. So just before we get into today's session, just a note that we won't actually be discussing any of the specifics of the HSE ransomware attack, or Jamie won't be talking about that in the Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over now to Owen Carroll to introduce Jamie and kick off the session.
Excellent. So we're delighted to have Dr. Jamie Collier here today. Jamie is a cyber threat intelligence consultant at FireEye. He was previously the cyber threat intelligence lead at Digital Shadows and has completed a PhD in cybersecurity at the University of Oxford, where he remains active as a research affiliate with the Centre of Technology and Global Affairs. Jamie was previously based at MIT as a cybersecurity Fulbright scholar and has experience working with the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence in Oxford, Analytica, and PwC in India. So delighted to have Jamie here today. So take it away, please.
Thanks, Owen. I'd remind everyone that Oxford Analytica is never to be confused with Cambridge Analytica before we get going. But let me just share my screen and we'll get into today's conversation. All right, so I assume you can kind of see my screen. What I want to do today is really talk all about that pathway to a successful CTI function. So how do we go from that initial stage? I know a lot of these initial sessions are on those early stages. How do we go from that and really start building something that's actually a crucial component of our security function, our broader organization as a whole? So to do this, really going to talk about 3 different areas. I'm going to first introduce cyber threat intelligence. I think with this being session 6, I'm going to assume you're all probably pretty familiar with threat intelligence by now. So I won't belabor the point, and that's really more about getting to a intelligence-led strategy before going into, first of all, that pathway to success, and then talking a little bit about that proactive response. I think one thing we have to acknowledge is that different individuals within a security function might have certain preconceived ideas about exactly what threat intelligence is or isn't. So we actually need to make a really strong case for the opportunities of threat intelligence. And I think a lot of that comes down to that proactive response that I'm going to speak to. So if we start off introducing cyber threat intelligence, and actually what I want to do is instead talk about this in terms of an intelligence-led strategy. I'm going to assume all of you here today understand what threat intelligence is as a whole. And when we talk about an intelligence-led strategy, that is more about how it can be applied to the security function, to the organization as a whole. And that's really about leveraging intelligence to have that really proactive cyber defense posture, as I'm going to talk about, and making sure it's really informing organizational wide decisions to really reduce cyber risk. So a lot of that might seem relatively obvious. What I want to do is actually talk about this in terms of a process, because I think if we can clarify what this means to those different stakeholders, to the CISO, to the executive team, that can really help us make a strong case for threat intelligence. So for me, it's really 3 things, threat intelligence. It's a 3-step process. First of all, it's about identifying relevant threats. Those could be threats within our own network, could be threats operating within Ireland, for example, or it could be sector-wide threats. What's going on in the banking sector or the healthcare sector? If we're able to identify those relevant threats, we're then able to take action off the back of that insight. So that might be patching vulnerabilities that are exploited by prominent actors that target our sector. It might be focusing detection efforts on particular ransomware variants that we're worried about. It could be about threat hunting, inserting security controls. Really, the list goes on. All those different actions, and I think that's the critical question. What actions can we take? And if we can do that, if we can identify relevant threats and then take action on the back of those threats, then we're in a really exciting spot where we're actually able to improve security outcomes. And that's really why we're all here, why we're doing threat intelligence, to detect threats, to validate our controls, to have that intelligence-led strategy driving us. Of course, it's not just about identifying relevant threats, it's about understanding the security controls and how we can kind of map our decisions to those threats. And I talk about this in terms of being really pragmatic, right? We're all operating in resource-constrained environments, limited investment, so we've got to be really smart with that investment. And if we were allowed outside our homes, we went to a cybersecurity conference, we went to the vendor hall, there'd be no shortage of different solutions and magic potions, certainly no shortage of vendors that are willing to take our money. So really what threat intelligence does is actually say, well, these would be the smartest investments based on the threat landscape that you're in. This is where it would make the most sense to focus. And then rather than looking at all these different solutions and thinking they all sound great, you can actually be really clinical and really focused. So I actually liken this to multivitamins and different vitamins and supplements. I could probably, if you gave me half an hour, I could probably give you a compelling case why you should take a green tea extract, or why you should take some kind of beetroot powder, vitamin C, vitamin D, etc. But if you took about 500 of those different supplements, those different pills, I'm not quite sure what would happen to you, but it'd be pretty sure it'd be bad news, right? So same thing goes for cybersecurity. We can't realistically purchase all of these different solutions. So using intelligence can really help guide our strategy as a whole. And then I think the other part of threat intelligence that's maybe forgotten is it's about navigating distraction. We want to both understand what we need to focus on, what's really relevant to us, but also understand where we can get distracted, where we can waste resources. This is a really good example. If we go back to March 2020, I think every cybersecurity news site was talking about COVID phishing. I think given the interest in COVID, there was that sense that we needed to provide a cybersecurity angle. Well, actually, we took an empirical approach. We found during that period, COVID was only really featuring in around 2% of the phishing emails we were seeing as an organization. So again, I think that just highlights that the news isn't threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is all about focus, all about filtering out what maybe is more of a distraction than what really matters. But I want to get into this idea of this pathway to success. So we've got a lot of experience working with government organizations, working with private sector, helping them to either build out or mature their CTI function. And that cumulative experience has given us a good understanding of what we would talk about in terms of our pathway to success, that gold standard, if you like. Now, often when people talk about threat intelligence, we talk about this process, this life cycle. And I think in some ways this is good. It provides a broad understanding of threat intelligence. But I think in my view, it is also maybe a little bit too abstract. So this provides a nice overview, gives us a sense of how things might work. But I think we need to get really serious about translating what is effectively a conceptual flow into actually a really pragmatic discussion about what this looks like. So I can give you a few examples, but we could talk in grand terms about building out a collection or the analytical techniques. I think as an industry, we seem to be obsessed about talking about, say, analytical techniques, fighting bias in our kind of analytical analysis, etc. But it might actually be that if we talk about collection and analysis, that some organizations are going to really lean on a vendor or a partner to provide that for them. If you're a government department, you might be really reliant on your intelligence agencies, your cybersecurity centers, for instance. So, you might in a government department have your own analysts, but it's probably going to be a lot about synthesizing and re-articulating what has been said by other partners, by other suppliers. So if we take something like collection, analysis, or production, We actually don't see too much of that seriously pragmatic discussion about, well, how do I translate what my vendor's giving me into my organization? Is it a copy paste job? Do I need to do a bit of my own analysis? How do I combine what's coming from say a government alert and a vendor? How much should I trust those partners? What do I actually want to use them for? And where do I want to do my own heavy lift? So I think in that sense, this is maybe something that is, as I said, good conceptual flow, good overview, but actually when it comes to building out a function, I think we need to look at this in slightly different terms with a bit more focus on pragmatism. So as I said, we've got a lot of experience working with different threat intelligence, working with different threat intelligence teams, helping governments set up CTI functions from scratch, helping really sophisticated private sector organizations mature their capabilities. And of course, when we look at those different organizations, they're all going to have very different situations, use cases, stakeholder requirements, and we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't forget that threat intelligence will look quite different in different parts of the world and in different contexts. But I think based on all of that cumulative experience, we've seen, despite the fact that there are all these differences in threat intelligence functions, there are also a lot of similarities. And actually what we found that there are these key elements, what we call that gold standard. Those are the things that if you're able to adopt these, that's going to really make sure that you're maximizing the chances that intelligence is going to be a key part of your overall cybersecurity strategy. That capability that you have is going to be underpinned by formalized structure and clear process, that its intelligence is integrated into, say, the technology stack that you have more broadly. And I think critically, if you could kind of take one thing from this talk, it's that the CTI function acts as a service provider to the organization. So that the capability really needs to take on that service provider mindset. So let's talk about this in turn. So first of all, we've got established the foundations. These should really be at the onset of any CTI program. I think a common pitfall among CISOs and directors that are really ambitious is to really try and have that advanced cutting edge capabilities, yet without putting into place some really basic requirements and foundations. You could go and hire a bunch of former Intel analysts from the NSA, from GCHQ, from the CIA, but if you don't have that really clear understanding of, well, what are they actually going to do, then maybe that talent falls short. Maybe it's not actually realizing what you need to do. But if we can do this, if we can first of all build out that cyber threat profile that I'm going to talk about in a minute, really understanding our threat landscape, and then I think critically, it's about that stakeholder needs. It's about those intelligence requirements. Intelligence requirements are right at the very top of that intelligence lifecycle. But I think actually often we only pay that lip service. We talk very briefly about requirements and then we kind of move on. Actually, requirements should be critical to everything we do. They should really underpin that entire cycle. And it's easy to forget that. As obvious as it seems to put stakeholder needs first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pitfalls, the different influences that we need to be aware of. So moving on, it's then really about implementing practices. So this includes developing process, expanding knowledge and expertise. We need a clear and documented process to manage the intelligence lifecycle. We can kind of start doing this in an ad hoc way. Oh, let's write this weekly summary for the CISO. Let's do a kind of monthly vulnerability report. But actually, we want a process. We want a kind of a sense of what we're committing to, why we're doing it, how we're going to do it. And then, of course, equally important is that technology integration. Most organizations will need the right technology to manage and automate all of those different security challenges. I think a big challenge for threat intelligence is making sure it speaks to that broader portfolio that you're working with. If you're helping the vulnerability management team, that you're actually speaking in terms that make sense to them, that work with their workflows. You're not sending emails to people that never read their emails. Maybe some people are going to want a PowerPoint delivered to them every quarter, maybe a CISO, for instance. Others might want notices via Slack. So it's really getting to know those different technologies, whether it's kind of communication, whether it's kind of threat intelligence platforms, SIEMs, etc. And I think at the very end of this is realizing capabilities. So that's where the really exciting stuff starts to happen. It's proactive detection of threats, high fidelity analysis, allowing leadership to make fast decisions to reduce risk, for instance. Of course, return on investment in threat intelligence, always going to be tricky. effectively trying to prove a negative, trying to prove something didn't happen. But I think if we're realizing capabilities, then we're in a really good place to make a compelling case around threat intelligence and its return on investment. So as I said, one of the main things is a cyber threat profile. That's a really great foundation. This is really about looking at both the threat landscape for an organization, but then also combining that with an understanding of the internal operating environment. So if we think about the threat landscape, understanding the threats that matter to us, we have limited bandwidth. We don't want to be worried about every threat to the same degree. We want to be really pragmatic, focusing on what matters to us. We can do that maybe in two ways. We can first of all look at what we've seen in our own network. Probably the best source of intelligence is previous intrusions, for instance, previous malicious activity on a network. But then we can combine that with that external view. What are we seeing more broadly in our geography, in our country, in those sectors and industries? What are those kind of prominent threat actors, those prominent trends that are going on that we need to be concerned about? And then, of course, we're combining that with the internal operating environment. But this really helps us to focus minds, to focus monitoring, detection, and response capabilities. Having that internal operating environment also allows us to understand the crown jewels. What does the organization actually really care about? And that allows us to focus on, well, what are the threats to those different areas, as well as, say, focus on, what vulnerabilities to prioritize, mapping what matters from an internal perspective with that external threat landscape. But I want to say on some of those other areas, as I said, getting to know your stakeholders, building relationships with stakeholders, really critical. So this is a few parts of this. It's first of all, of course, to identify those relevant stakeholders, but then it's actually to get to know those people. As I said, some people are going to have preconceived notions of what threat intelligence is or isn't. There might be reservations or skepticism. So actually being able to build relationships and work iteratively together to say, well, look, the threat intelligence function is here to help you. We can do all of these different things. It's almost like we've got a menu of different possibilities in terms of the different reports, the different sort of things we could provide, but actually working with those stakeholders to say, well, what's going to be most useful to you? What are going to be your own use cases? What are the challenges that you're working on? Let's figure this out together in terms of how threat intelligence can really assist in those challenges. And then from there, we can get into a pragmatic discussion of what does that actual intelligence product look like? How often is it going to be sent? What format? Let's kind of get some feedback off the back of that. So in that regard, when we talk about getting to know stakeholders, we'll often think about this in terms of strategic, operational, and tactical intelligence. Now, some people might also put technical intelligence in there. Some might also argue about the order of these, maybe putting tactical in between, strategic and operational. Personally, I don't kind of love that approach. I think it serves as a useful guide, but we need to be careful. And we need to be careful because really what should be driving our threat intelligence is those stakeholders, that column on the right. And we might have different types of stakeholders, right? We might have one CISO that doesn't really have a security background, very much a kind of executive technology risk type person. That CISO might kind of leave the organization and be replaced by someone that previously worked in a SOC that's a real kind of techie. So actually, as much as we want to have that idea of yes, certain sort of reports are probably going to be better suited to a CISO than a security operations center analyst, we actually need to get to know those stakeholders first and then figure out what the intelligence product should be. So it's really letting stakeholders and requirements driving products rather than kind of the other way around, if you like. Now, this might all seem very obvious, right? So building a requirements-driven approach is, I think, critical. And it's something that we should really be relentless throughout that intelligence lifecycle in making sure that our products, our efforts are aligned to stakeholder requirements. And it's a process with no finish line, right? So it's not something we do once. We kind of get to know our stakeholders and we think, great job, crack open a couple of cold ones and think, that's us done. We can kind of get on with the juicy stuff, the actual analysis. This is something that we need to be constantly doing. It's dynamic and iterative. It's not a static exercise. But if implemented correctly, this is where we're going to see that return in investment. A requirements-driven approach is going to drive standards. It's going to improve security outcomes. It's going to really enable CTI to become an essential component of a security function. Now, why do I talk about that? I talk about this because despite the importance, it's easy for CTI teams to be led astray. CTI teams may simply fall into the habit of writing regular reports, yet without really serious engagement on whether these reports and products are actually useful. With all these interesting developments in the cyber threat landscape, I think analysts can also be driven by their own pet interests. And of course, we want to encourage that passion, but we want to make sure it's aligned to what the business or the organization is really concerned about. And I think, of course, it's also important for CTI teams to really step up during breaking news, emerging developments. But we should avoid rushing between breaking stories in the news without a clear strategy underpinning those efforts. So a requirement-driven approach, really important. And as I said, although simple in theory, there are these other pitfalls that can potentially lead us astray. So having that real disciplined practice and coming back to requirements, really important. The other part of a requirements-driven approach is feedback. And again, end of the intelligence life cycle, but I think we often kind of give this lip service. We don't take it seriously enough. Feedback is crucial to really honing in on that requirements-driven approach. So I've got a few ideas here on how we can actually optimize this. First of all is that learning culture, right? No one likes to hear criticism, and having a culture where we can kind of read feedback, we can read points for improvement and really thrive on that. That's really important. That needs to really be a precedent set from both the CISO as well as the head of a CTI team. Need to embrace feedback, need to actually be able to enjoy that process. We should also celebrate the positives, right? Feedback isn't just about understanding where we could improve. It's also about understanding, well, what worked really well. And that's not just for morale and to keep the CTI team happy. If they understand the positives, that can also help them really hone in on intelligence quality. It can enable them to be a bit more proactive in producing the sort of analysis that they know those different teams respond well to. It can also help, of course, to demonstrate return on investment through that positive feedback. Feedback is also a practice, right? It's got to be integrated into routines. There's got to be set times to actually do this. And in that sense, often we'll see that this literally just doesn't happen, right? Analysts will write up an intelligence report, feel the job is done. So making sure that it's actually part of the culture, really important. One piece to maybe consider here is to make it easy for stakeholders to provide feedback and to lower the friction. So do I need to actually, if I want to set up feedback, do I need to kind of create some new accounts? Do I need to put in a password for all of that? Or can I just click? Do I know who to contact? Is there an email address that's readily available at the end of an intelligence report, or a feedback form that is just click, done, I can send that feedback in, right? So is it transparent? Is it accessible? It's also a two-way street, right? So CTI teams are often the experts. They really understand how to leverage threat intelligence. And we might be working with stakeholders that don't necessarily understand that. So actually building out those relationships and providing advice, saying, look, you could use CTI to do all of these different things. You're struggling to know what vulnerabilities to patch. Well, why don't we look at the vulnerabilities that are currently being exploited by threat actors? That's something where intelligence can help. So providing that guide, providing that critique, really important. And then finally, it's about that human connection. It's about getting to know these people, preferably face-to-face. Might not be possible right now, but building those relationships not only helps us to understand each other, but it means that stakeholders are going into intelligence with a positive spirit. It means it's easier for analysts to maybe take some of that constructive criticism if they have that human connection, if they realize, it's okay, or they might be more comfortable providing suggestions on how to utilize CTI if they're not fearful that they're interfering or overstepping the mark. So if we could do all of that, I think that provides a really good foundation. And if we kind of want to take this further, it's really then about shifting to a proactive response. So I think maybe in the past, and maybe where there are still some preconceived ideas around threat intelligence, is it's very reactive. It's a very much a kind of indicator-led approach. So we're taking indicators, which can certainly be useful to, say, quickly block or alert malicious activity. But actually, if we're dealing with sophisticated threat actors, they can get around some of those kind of approaches pretty easily. And it also creates a risk of organizations being overwhelmed with false positives. So what we really want to do is actually shift to a proactive response. Here we're focusing on attack techniques and modus operandi, leveraging, say, MITRE attack frameworks, for instance, a really holistic view, using YARA rules that can allow us to be much more out the blocks in hunting and detecting malicious activity on our network, an approach that's integrated with other components of a security function. So I'll talk about this in the next few minutes. I know there've previously been discussions on MITRE ATT&CK. Whenever I look at this, I think, wow, it's quite overwhelming. All of these different attacker techniques. We could, theoretically, we could invest in all these areas. We could really improve our security controls. But actually, if threat actors are conducting these attacks circled in red, then actually, while those investments in green might have improved security, it's not aligned to the threat. It's not actually improved our risk, our situation at all. So different ways to leverage MITRE. We can, of course, do mapping. I think we can take this to the next level with that proactive response if we do both mapping, but then take those attacker attributes, right? So we're looking at the files, the file names, the processes being executed. That all gives us that real deep insight to actually start much more proactive discovery. We can also leverage playbooks. So looking at the prominent attacker techniques that are in our sector, in our geography, for instance. And we can also do that on a global level. So if you read the most recent FireEye M Trends report, we actually provide overall view of what are those attacker techniques that we see time and time again. These are what I call high leverage security decisions, right? So you can see for initial access, it's the likes of phishing and exploiting public facing applications that take up the vast majority of the threat landscape. There's been a huge amount of discussion recently on supply chain compromise. I think it's still a really important topic, but you can see at the bottom of the screen, actually, it's a relatively small proportion of the entire threat landscape. So having that pragmatic view, focusing on what matters based on empirical evidence, I think that's really important. And we can start to think of different proactive ways to use intelligence, right? So we could take that intelligence-led red team. So rather than just have a red team come and find a load of things that are broken with your security and say, look, this is how we owned you, can we actually map that to threat actors that are really relevant? So if we're thinking, say, a red team for a banking sector organization, well, that red team should then be aligning itself. It should be trying to execute those attack techniques that are really prominent in the banking sector. Looking at those MITRE heat maps, looking at what's most likely to impact those organizations. And then I think that the area which I think is kind of where this is going, a lot of what we talked about so far is about understanding which security controls to actually introduce. But then it's actually about attacker emulation through something like validation that then allows us to actually test, well, do those security controls actually work? So we're taking that intelligence-led approach, executing attacker techniques that are actually conducted by attackers, threat actors that are relevant. And what that, if we can actually validate those security controls, we're not just identifying which security controls to introduce, but we're validating them. We can then say, well, look, we've seen this ransomware story in the news or this big espionage case. If that group were to target us tomorrow, would they be successful or not? And if they wouldn't be successful, maybe we can sleep a bit more easily at night. And if they would be successful, then we actually know exactly which security controls they're bypassing and where to focus. I'm running up into time. So the last thing I want to talk about is intelligence-led vulnerability management. And this is really just about having, again, it's a proactive response, so many different things to patch nowadays. So actually we can really start to focus on this much more clearly if we focus on vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited. So I can give you this example here, right? Where Spectre Meltdown, they dominated the news agenda, really interesting vulnerabilities. You can see those vulnerabilities in black were associated to Spectre and Meltdown. But actually, if you look at those vulnerabilities at the bottom, those highlighted in gray, they're some of the most exploited vulnerabilities that we're seeing. Sorry, I should have explained that what you're looking at here is the number of media mentions of these different vulnerabilities. So the bottom line is that actually we can get really distracted when it comes to vulnerabilities. We can focus on things that are kind of trending in the news, when actually what we want to focus on is what's actively being exploited. And I think if we can do that, we're in a really good spot to actually be, aligning our efforts when it comes to something like vulnerability management to the threat landscape at hand. But anyway, that's enough waffle for me. I'll pause here. Happy to take any questions at this time.
Hey, Jamie, that was excellent, and really appreciate you coming in today. We have a quiet audience today. I don't see many questions. There was just one question about will this be recorded and slides available? The answer is yes to both. Jamie, I might pop in. I don't think there's any other questions right now, but I think that was excellent. And I love the way you talked about the threat kind of portfolio and understanding who your actors are and stuff. And I think maybe sometimes people get a little bit overwhelmed, right? Because there's so many different elements to some of these cyber programs and defense strategies, etc. But ultimately, I suppose, if you're talking to your CISO and you're justifying costs, etc. I mean, I suppose if we class the actors down to kind of the everyday type of threats, the malware, then there's maybe the opportunistic type threats where if you get a big vulnerability, just like you spoke about there, Meltdown and Spectre didn't really get weaponized, or but the likes of Eternal Blue, right, was a big opportunistic one, right? And then you have the more targeted stuff like the SolarWinds, etc. So I imagine going kind of different levels of maturity and kind of going to your CISO and going, we can protect against everyday malware. We've basic hygiene. Then you get to the next level and the next level. So I imagine for companies, if you can approach it that way, it does help, rather than thinking about every single individual actor, if you can kind of group it into levels of maturity, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as threat intelligence community, we definitely get guilty of focusing on really specific threats or finding certain areas really interesting. I think what we've got to do is translate that conversation into, not let me give you a deep dive into this threat actor for the sake of it. Let me actually translate that into, where does the CISO want to go? What are the challenges the CISO has? And then I think almost certainly threat intelligence can play a role there. I think of course your point is very well made that you've got to get the basics right first. You don't want to kind of go for threat intelligence if you don't have those foundations in place. But actually, a lot of those foundations, threat intelligence can really help build them, take them to the next level.
Excellent, thanks a lot, Jamie. And there was one question there. How do we find out what are the current vulnerabilities being exploited?
Yeah, so I mean that's an interesting question. There's probably a few different. So I can think in terms of FireEye Mandiant, where we will be looking at that from a quite a pragmatic perspective, just in terms of what we're seeing, in terms of the incident response engagements, what we're seeing in the sort of the malware we're observing through our kind of endpoints, all of the sort of kit we're seeing. But I think so clearly working with vendors is one area. I think actually the other area that's open source is some of those government advisories, right, where we see really fantastic information coming out of a lot of the cybersecurity agencies that are really helping us protect ourselves. They're clarifying these are the vulnerabilities you should be really concerned about. So few ideas there, but I think certainly working with organizations and partners that really understand this stuff is definitely important.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Jamie. And one other one I actually kind of use myself as well is Intel 471, who I find really great. I imagine you probably use those as well. Just they're pretty good. You can sign up for a lot of alerts. They're free as well with them, and they have a lot of information from what's actually been used on the underground and stuff like that as well. So I think that's a really great resource. And I think they do have some free feeds you can sign up for there as well. So.
Yeah, and we do have some free feeds with our Advantage kind of freemium. I don't want to plug too many products, but some of our threat intelligence is made available for free through that. So please do sign up if that's something that's kind of useful for you guys.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll just jump on that last one, because on the vulns and exploits I work quite a bit is they're looking for what are the kind of current trends. I think by understanding like what's been used on the underground, the dark web, and what's been exploited, and you probably will need a third party to help you out with that and give you the feeds for that. But I mean, that's generally how you kind of go about it, to understand what's actually being looked for on the dark web, exploits that are available for sale, etc. And that kind of drives up your prioritization. As Jamie showed, it was an excellent diagram I think, Jamie, you had there to show kind of when you need to kind of get worried about, not necessarily when a vulnerability comes out, but then if it's going to be exploited, if it's being weaponized, etc.
Yeah, sure thing.
I think that's all we have for today. Thanks a lot, Jamie, for coming in. And just to briefly kind of mention as well, next month we have Ishmael Valenzuela and we have Carlos Diaz from McAfee coming in. They're going to talk about threat hunting and playbooks. And at that point, then I think what we might do is we might try and get some feedback from the community, from yourselves, on how you feel this is going, and anything you'd like to see from this intelligence group going forward. Because we're probably going to regroup at that point. And the other point is that if you are interested in becoming part of the core team, it's primarily been myself and Andy Greaves with the help of Owen and Anne from Cyber Ireland driving this. But if you are interested in becoming part of the core team, please do reach out to Owen or myself through the Cyber Ireland website, or get me on LinkedIn or Andy. Because what we will do at the end of June is we're going to regroup, as I said, and we'll try and figure out, we would love to expand that core team, right? Because it's all about a collaborative community effort here, and it would be great to get more people involved, different subject matter experts. And then maybe later in the year, we may look at doing kind of more deeper hands-on sessions with different tools, etc. But we need to get a lot more people involved for that. So please do give your feedback. We'll send out a survey maybe next month, and also reach out to us directly if you're interested in the core team. So thanks a lot for your time today, and really, really great thanks to Jamie. I thought that was excellent. Thank you.